Hey everybody, and welcome to the Master Level Marriage Podcast, where we discuss all things marriage and where you can discover the tools that you need to have a strong and healthy relationship. Our host, author, and marriage coach, Dr. Ronnie Gaines, will unpack many facets of a marital relationship as he dives into the dynamics of a marriage. In each episode, you will learn what it takes to succeed in your relationship and win in your marriage. Whether you are in the planning stages or have been married for several years, our desire is to help you grow and enrich your life as a couple and become a success story. Subscribe or follow us and be notified of each episode. Please leave us a review and help us help other couples. For more information, visit www.masterlevelmarriage.com. Thanks for checking us out. Now here's your host, Dr. Ronnie Gaines.
Welcome to the Master Level Marriage Podcast. I'm your host, Ronnie Gaines, and I'm so glad that you're here with me on this show today. I want to say thank you to all those who are downloading the podcast. Every time you download, every time you leave a review or something in that nature, it puts us on a different level, different platform for those to see our show, to maybe it pops up on their feed. So thank you. The more you download, the more people get to hear the show. Thank you. I thank you for the comments. Thank you for the comments about the show and how it means to you, how much it means to you. And I thank you for that. On this show today, I want to take you to an airport in New Delhi, India, where I was traveling with a friend of mine who is a missionary and an evangelist that travels all over the world. And we were flying together. He was doing a conference, a crusade to about 15 to 18,000 people, a lot of people. And I closed our time out with the people in India with a marriage conference. What an incredible trip, and what an incredible time we spent there in India. But on the way, when we were traveling through New Delhi, we had a lot of layover time. We pulled out the equipment, and I did a podcast show with Joshua Wagner, this great friend of mine, talking about his marriage, talking about kids, talking about how he keeps his marriage healthy. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. So without further ado, let's go into that airport with a little bit of background noise, but let's go into that airport as I have this conversation with Josh. I know you can hear the background noise. I am sitting at New Delhi, India. Just flew in. We're in the airport waiting for our next transfer over to the next area that we're going. I say we're because I'm in the presence of a friend of mine. I'll be introducing him in just a moment. But we're here in the airport and getting ready to transfer to Chandigarh. We're going to be spending a week in Ludhiana, Punjab.
That's right.
And so we're going to be there. We're looking forward to spending that time. We're going to do a pastor's conference and a marriage conference. So I'm really excited about that. But I want to introduce a friend of mine that's with me today. I'm traveling with him, Joshua Wagner. So glad to have you on this podcast today. And I'm going to be asking him some questions in just a moment. I'm going to let him talk. But we've really geared this podcast today, this show, basically as him being my guest. So I'm glad that you're here today. Josh, come on, greet this group of people on our show.
Well, it's an honor to be on your podcast, Pastor Ronnie. I've known you now for over a decade, and you've been such a wonderful friend and a great person to work with in ministry. And it's so exciting for me to have you here in India, sort of on the front lines of what I'm doing on a regular basis. So for those who don't know, I help run a international evangelistic organization, and we work primarily in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, doing large-scale crusades for those who are lost, and working with pastors and leaders in these nations to help do all of the follow-up discipleship work with those new believers. And so it's an honor for me to be able to travel and see what things God does all over the world. And it's so exciting to have you with me on this trip that we're going to be doing here in Northwest India this week.
Yeah, I know it's going to be fun. We took a little bit to get set up right here. We're in a area where there's several restaurants, and so we thought this might be the best place to do this. So
Yeah, well, when you've got a few hours to kill in the airport in between transfers, nothing like sitting up in a food court for
That's
the
right.
podcast. And we've got a lot of people who are taking notice as they're walking by, wondering what these two white guys are doing. But it's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So you may see some walk in front of our camera. They've already walked in front of the camera several times, so
Yeah.
they may still do that today.
Yeah.
Listen, we're just here for a conversation.
That's
We're here
right.
having fun. This is not a formal podcast today or show today, but I'm excited, Josh, because I've got some questions for you, and this is all about marriage. And so I thought, why not just ask you some things? You've been married for a little while now. Why don't you give us a little rundown before I
Sure.
ask the question about where you are in this thing called marriage?
Sure. So I am married to my high school sweetheart, Michelle, and we got married about 11 and a half years ago. We have 4 children, 7, 5, 4, and 2. And so our house is constant excitement, never a dull moment. And so I'm in full-time ministry. She's a full-time mom. She also homeschools our 2 oldest children. So she is very busy. And especially on these trips when I'm traveling, a lot of, the responsibilities fall on her. And so grateful for her, so thankful to God that He brought us together those many years ago. And she's the only girl I've ever dated, ever been with, ever kissed, anything. She's it, and forever will be. And so thankful to God for her, and passionate about marriage. We've helped do premarital counseling for so many couples over the years. I've had the pleasure of marrying so many couples, and it's always a joy to be able to walk through marital subjects with others, and happy to share about our marriage here today.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity and the pleasure to meet Michelle before I ever met you.
That's right.
I know that I was moving my daughter into the dorms at Oral Roberts University, and my son was there with us, helping us, and so we're out in the parking lot. We see this young, blonde, beautiful girl getting out of her car, having trouble with her keyboard. And so my son, being the gentleman he is, went over and helped her carry her keyboard up. That was just a start of our relationship together, because I was in some classes with her and you. We were in some classes together, and her and another girl was we were a team, like a group study, and so we were on a team together, which was really cool. So I've known Michelle longer than you, but not too much longer.
Right.
Then we come to know you. You came and helped us at the church. You and Michelle both did some worship for us for a little while. So I've watched you guys dating and now married, and now all of these kids.
Yes, praise God.
Yeah, that's a blessing. The scripture says that it's they're like arrows in a quiver. And
That's right.
I think your quiver's full, right?
Yes, it is full. That's right.
Yeah. So Josh, we're gonna tackle a couple questions here in the few minutes that we take on this show. But I want to pose a question to you that probably somewhat the same in a lot of relationships and a lot of marriage. We all deal with conflict. I like to say this, that there's his truth, her truth, and the real truth. And,
Sure.
And so when we think we're right, we're going to argue. And so we're going to go into conflict. You wouldn't argue if you didn't think you were right.
Right.
And so every marriage goes through conflict. You cannot go through marriage without fights. You got to have a fight. But I want to ask you a couple of questions about what are the 2 things, and we'll take one at a time.
Sure.
What are 2 of the things that are probably your most, let's say the biggest challenge that you and Michelle have as a married couple that cause the most arguments, conflict, or whatever? Let's take the first one.
Okay. Yeah, I would say, first of all, just say that I'm really grateful, because I do feel that we've got a very healthy marriage, and we've been able to avoid so many difficulties, and so much of that is a product of good communication skills. That being said, I would say that one of the primary challenges that we face that does lead to conflict and fights has to do at times with a lack of communication. We've got a busy schedule. We, as a result of that, things can get lost in the shuffle. And I may tell her something, hey, just so you know, I've got a meeting here on this day, and I'll tell it to her in passing. And now she didn't really fully register that, and she's got some other conflict, something to do with the kids or their schedule or whatever it may be. And that can lead, unfortunately, to unnecessary problems. So one of the things that we've really tried to implement is during the weekend, before the week sort of begins, we'll get out our calendars. We go through the process of, okay, what do you have going on this week so that I know I need you here, or you're going to be gone at this time, or whatever it may be. Because, so much of our lives, if we're not careful, we will schedule so many things with so many other people, but we don't necessarily schedule what we need to with our spouse. And if I am not careful, I can begin to prioritize, tangential relationships. I love you, Pastor Ronnie, but you're not as important to me as my wife. Yet, if I'm not careful, I will begin to elevate the relationship that I have with you above her based on how I'm communicating with her with other people. And so it's very important to her that I communicate ahead of time in a way that makes her feel like she's the most important person. Hey, what are your priorities? What do I need to work around your schedule to make sure that you feel loved and appreciated and cared for? And just for good communication skills in general. And so, communicating in a way that is open, in a way that is clear and concise, but having designated times to be able to go over those things so as to avoid some of those natural pitfalls is the type of thing that we have found to be very helpful.
Yeah, I think what you hit on is key, as when you say you planned it.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times we just haphazardly go through our relationship not planning. You can't plan everything.
Yes.
Everything can't be planned.
Yeah.
But many things can.
Right.
And I think that just sitting down and writing, especially the way you travel and things like that, is to make sure that you cover all the bases.
Yeah.
I know many times you know my wife well, and so many times I'll walk into the room and I will be in the middle of a thought. That is where I start talking, and
sure.
and she looks at me like, "What in the world are you talking about?"
Yes.
And I tell people this, that if we're not in a good place in our relationship, that when those moments happen and she looks at me with this look on her face and says, "What are you talking about?" I get offended, and I have a tendency to well, just never mind, just walk out. Mm-hmm. But when your marriage is in a good place and you keep it in a good place, these kinds of things were like, you stop for a moment, and at that moment, this happened, and I think I've even mentioned this in another show.
Sure.
This happened, and she said, "What are you talking about?" And I had to stop for a moment and think, wait a minute, I didn't communicate everything with her.
Yeah.
So I said, let me go back and start over. And whenever I did, she's like, well, this makes more sense. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes we don't communicate clearly.
Yeah.
And often enough.
Well, and I think, if you fail to plan, then you really plan to fail. And I think that, the season of life that we're in, we have 4 young children. We have to be strategic about those conversations. If the reality is this, if I try to have a meaningful conversation during the day when my children are awake, and they're all young where they still need various things, they need somebody to take them to the bathroom in some cases, they need somebody to feed them, they need somebody to do all sorts of things. It's easy for those important conversations to be interrupted. And so what we have to strategically do is say, okay, hey, I'll tell Michelle, hey, Sunday night, I want to have a conversation with you about what our week looks like. I know not to do that during Sunday afternoon when my kids are awake and need because it's going to be too distracting. And so you have to create plans, and different seasons are differently. You and Miss, you don't have kids living at the house anymore, so it looks different than it does in my season. But you're going to have many people listening to this that are in the same season of life as me, and you have to be strategic about having those conversations. Sometimes those conversations happen in the vehicle, and I'll tell the kids, hey guys, we're going to this place for the next 20 minutes. I need to talk to your mom about some things, and whatever it may be. But just try to create those moments where you're able to have focused time.
Yeah, and sometimes I think parents, they kind of feel like their kids kind of get in the way.
Right.
But kids your age, that your children are at a very critical stage in their life, and they're high maintenance. They take a lot of time. So like you said, you've got to be strategic with that time.
Yeah.
And maybe even in the evenings, put them to bed and set some, instead of getting in front of the TV,
Right.
Getting on our phones and,
Yep.
and say, in the next 15 minutes, let's talk about what's going on. Did we miss something for the day? So it really is communicating. It's finding those debriefing moments,
Yes.
if you will,
Yes.
of saying, there's no kids, no
Yep.
interruption.
Yep.
Turn the phones, turn the TVs off, turn all the technological devices off, and let's just have a meaningful conversation
That's
and
right.
get caught up.
That's right.
Because there's many things that I don't tell my wife. I
Right.
forget to.
Right.
And so all of a sudden someone comes up and says, oh, by the way, what about this? And she looks at me and she's like, you didn't tell me that. And I'm like, I totally forgot. Or I thought I told you. And it's not just being that I don't want, it's not that I don't want to tell her.
It's not intentional,
No.
yeah.
It's just not being intentional about communicating
That's
and
right.
planning that.
That's
so
right.
So
Yeah.
communicate. You hit the very first one that almost probably 99.9% of couples
Yes.
deal with. I've heard this many times. People come to my office, they sit down, the first thing out of their mouth,
Yeah.
we just can't communicate.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the most difficult problems in a marriage because you got two different personalities that are trying to get to the same destination,
Yeah.
and it takes both of them to get there, yet we don't speak each other's language.
That's right.
And if we do, we think we speak their language, then we're not speaking the language they need, we're speaking the language we think they need.
Right. Yes. Well, we often communicate to people in the way that we like to receive,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's so important when you talk about love languages or you talk about areas of communication that we know and then communicate to our spouse in the way that they receive, not the way we do, because oftentimes those are different.
Yeah, and I know that my wife and I are total opposites.
Sure.
She perceives things completely different than I do.
Right.
And sometimes she looks at me and she goes, I don't understand why you even would think that.
Sure.
And I look at her thinking, I don't even understand why you would think that
Sure.
way.
Yes.
So it's not trying to make that person like us.
No.
We have to be for them what they need and communicate in their language.
Well, and you married that person because of those differences. Those differences drew you to them. And so, you don't want to fashion them the same way as you because you didn't want to marry you. You wanted to marry that person. And so, recognize those differences not as something that needs to be corrected or changed. Rather, recognize them as something that you love and appreciate.
And that's why we married them.
That's right.
And I say this so many times with couples is that at the onset of the relationship, all of the differences are great.
Yeah.
But in the relationship, after a year, 2 years, or even 11, then those differences become kind of annoying.
Sure.
Because
exactly.
we want them to be like us.
Yes.
And that's not why we married them. We never married them so they would be like us.
That's right.
We married them for the difference.
That's right.
And so, again, that communication is so vital because you can't do anything without communication. I mean, even I argue with my GPS.
Sure.
And if I would just listen,
Yes.
the GPS gets me there because now our GPSs take us around traffic.
Right.
It takes us around an accident on the road.
Yeah.
Takes us the fastest route, whether it's the shortest distance, it takes us the fastest. So we have to learn how to listen to the other person and learn how to listen to them.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
So communication is huge. It's like that in every relationship that I've ever known. It's like that in mine. Just have to plan, be strategic, like you said, and learn how to communicate and communicate well.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to get out of this life without communicating.
That's right.
If you're going to get married, you're going to have to communicate.
That's
we
right.
might as well learn it.
That's right.
So, that being the first one, what is a number two thing that you think that you and Michelle deal with that causes some of the most conflict?
Well, I would say that, this is even somewhat related, but I think that, the first one talked a lot about scheduling and about, planning and creating those times for communication. I think that in the season of life that we're in, our kids end up being another source of conflict. And that's very open-ended. Whether it's, the way that we discipline. Maybe the way that I discipline for a certain thing is different than the way that Michelle would. The way that she handles the situation is different than what, I would. What I'm, sometimes I'll give the kids a treat, for example, and then she'll be like, I didn't want them to have that. Or I'll sign the kids up to do something, and she says, no, we've already got too much going on in our schedule. Or any number of things revolving around the kids. And the other thing, too, is, with 4 kids, just like me and Michelle are different, each of those kids are different. And so the way that I interact with each kid is unique to them. The way that even Michelle interacts with the different kid is unique to that kid. Yeah. And so sometimes I may say, that's not the way I would have handled that, Michelle, with that kid. But it's the way Michelle's relationship is with that child. And so recognizing those differences that each of us have as it pertains to the way that we relate and react and interact with our kids at times can cause conflict and cause problems. And then even just like the debriefing and the conversations that happen as a result of those things. And, one of the things that we've had to learn is, not only creating time, right, for conversations, but creating the atmosphere for those conversations. I've learned, man, these serious conversations, they should not happen when I'm really tired. Or they should not happen when I'm already angry about something else. Recognizing those things about your person and then creating the time frame and the environment, not just the time or the space, but the environment for those things to take place is so important.
Yeah, one of the things that my wife mentions a lot, and I know she mentions this to other couples as well, even your children have their own love language.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's important that we deal with them in that love language too. And I know that you have 4 kids, probably 4 completely different kids.
Right. Absolutely.
And you know my kids,
yes,
Kimberlyn and Bo, and how different they are.
Right.
And so, and they both have their love languages, and they have their ways to handle. My wife handled our children a lot different than I did.
Right.
I was pretty staunch, the old Marine Corps militant, and she was strategic.
Sure.
She did things. She taught me so many things about how to handle kids, which if I wasn't listening, it would cause the conflict with us. But she just had ways of redirecting the child. I wanted to just, I was very disciplinary, and so I was just going to take care of them. But she had a way that, and she does our grandkids the same way. If they're being kind of defiant in some way, she redirects their mind.
Yep.
Now, I know we just kind of veered off talking about kids, but that's okay.
Well, it's all part of the same thing. Yeah, you know, at least in my season of life, my marriage is attached to my children in so many ways. They are independent of one another. They have to be, or else, one of the dangers that you can have, and that unfortunately we have seen so often is, marriages can easily devolve whenever kids come along if you do not prioritize your marriage. Because your marriage and your children are different. And so many marriages, when kids are entered into the picture, their lives become consumed by their children. And then when the children grow up and move out of the house, they look at each other and say, man, I don't recognize you. I don't know you anymore. Right. And so you have to constantly ward against that. But yeah, certainly in the season of life at the same time, raising kids and my marriage, they are very interconnected. Yeah,
I was just visiting with a couple on the plane. We had a long trip from Chicago to Delhi. Almost 14 hours, and I sat next to a couple that was very young. They're in their 20s, and they had this child that was just under a year old, just getting ready to turn a year old, and that child kept me awake but they were such a great couple, and I had the opportunity to kind of speak into their life a little bit.
Good.
And it was on this very thing. But it was an arranged marriage.
Yes.
And they were Indian.
As is the custom in many instances in India.
And it was arranged, and he was stating that they had a lot of problems the first couple years in their relationship because just as some of us that dated.
Yeah.
You know, my wife and I dated for 6 years. And I know that you and Michelle dated for a while.
Yes, years, yeah.
And so we had that ability to kind of get to know each other over those 6 years. They were getting to know each other during the marriage,
Yes.
which is very complicated.
Yes, it is.
So we were talking about the children at that moment. They had and that's something that kind of brought them together, was having that child. It took some of the dynamics of the conflict and the things that was kind of pushing their marriage apart, brought them together.
Yes.
And this is what I mentioned to them. That child brought you together, and now you're working together because you have a common goal.
Yes.
But I said, whatever you do, don't focus primarily on just the child.
That's right.
You've got to find. Now, I understand that this little boy is under a year old, and,
Right.
and as I saw on the plane, he needs a lot of attention.
Needy.
He's
Yes.
needy. So, but at this point in that young life, it takes a lot of attention. However, if we only focus our attention on that, then when that child, and I told them this just this morning, I said, this little boy's going to grow up and he's going to go to his own wife and his own family. You're going to be alone.
Yes.
What matters over the next several years is going to determine how well you're going to take that child being gone.
Sure.
So you're right. This is the complication of children.
Well, and everybody raises their own families, and they may do so differently than I. I'm not saying my way is the only way to do it, for sure. I'll just tell you what's worked for me and my wife. When we started entering children into our marriage, there were conscious decisions that were made to ensure the health of the marriage would continue. And so, for example, we were never the type that would have our children sleep with us in our own bed. Again, I'm not saying that you're wrong if you do that. I'm just telling you what worked for me. And that was because I needed to protect that time with Michelle. Michelle and I have always been very scheduled with the kids' bedtimes. And when you go to bed, you go to your bed. You stay in your bed. And you are to give mommy and daddy this time. Because if you want us to be the best parents we can be, then we need to be the best husband and wife that we can be. And that has been critical to our marriage, because I know that throughout the course of the day, I have very little of Michelle's attention, her time. She has very little of mine. But I know that by 8 o'clock every night, my kids are going to be in bed. They're going to stay in their bed, Lord willing. And then I'm going to have a couple hours before I go to bed where it's focused time just with Michelle. And I can count on that. And that has really helped to protect the sanctity of the marriage in the midst of very needy seasons from our children.
Yeah, we were the same way. Our children could not. They would come in before they went to bed, especially when they got older. They would come in and lay across the bed with us.
Sure.
But when it was time, that was our time.
Yes.
And we kept that part of it sacred.
Yep.
And my wife was even very adamant that there was no TV allowed in our room. That it was a distraction. It could be a distraction for your marriage. So, yeah, that is one of the things that we did. We protected that with our kids, and Miss and I were very close over the years. Even when the kids were teenagers, we were out going on date nights, and I think Kimberly was 16 before my wife even let them stay home by themselves. But we protected our time together, because there's going to come a point in time, and it happened. I said this the other day when I was preaching. I couldn't believe it. Kimberlyn said it offended her, but I said, we don't even have kids in our 20s anymore.
Sure, right.
Our kids are in their 30s.
Right.
Now we're seeing Bo and Bailey, they don't have children yet, but Kimberlyn does, and you see some of those same things, those same patterns that's coming from the way she was raised over to her boys.
Yes, right.
Because they see what works.
Yeah.
And those children are,
and they want to replay what you did, what worked previously. They want to make sure happens again.
Yeah. So we have communication. We have kids.
Yeah.
Now you realize, Josh, that you have kind of been generic. I thought maybe you would come up with something that was maybe on our next podcast we'll be doing another one.
Yeah,
we're going to do another one maybe in Ludiano when we're there, or when we're leaving out. We're going to do another podcast together. But that is actually what I say is being some of the greatest, I should say the toughest parts of a marriage. I think communication is overarching.
Sure.
I think communication kind of is an umbrella over everything, because kids really has to do with the way we communicate with each other. And
so much of it does.
You were talking about how her perspective is a little bit different than yours.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of communication. When it comes to money, it's a communication problem a lot of times. And they say that the top three, many resources, the data out there would tell you the top three is money, kids, and sex.
Yeah.
And all of that is really around communication.
It is.
Josh, I really appreciate being on here with me today. And as a young perspective, I'm an older person, but as a young perspective, there's young couples out there that will hear this.
Yeah.
And it's really great to hear it from a young perspective, to know that, listen, as much as you love Michelle and everything seems great in your relationship, there's still things that are problems.
Of course.
And it's not sweeping those problems under a rug.
Yeah.
And just, it's confronting.
Yes.
It's the scripture tells us this: speak your truth in love.
Yes.
That it's okay to speak your complaint, but speak it in love. Mm-hmm. That's how you know what she needs.
That's right.
That's how you know what Michelle needs, and that's how she knows what you need.
That's right.
Again, Josh, I want to thank you for being on this podcast today. Let's do another one.
Yes.
While we're here in India.
Yeah, and we're gonna get even. You said my answers were too generic this episode, so I do apologize. The next episode will be much more specific.
You don't have to apologize. But it's generic because we all deal with the same thing.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the complications and probably some of the conflict that you have on a different scale on our next episode.
That sounds good.
I'm looking forward to us hanging out and being in a conversation again. So, hey, I just want to thank you guys again for being a part of this today, being a part of this show. And I just always want to leave you with this: be your best self, live out your full potential, and experience your best marriage. I'll see you on the next show.